Hi there, and welcome to this, the very first Explaining History podcast of 2016. Hope you guys all had a great Christmas break. Mine was spent devouring, as you can guess, a variety of history books I received, all neatly wrapped. But anyway, less of that chat, and let's get on with talking about something that actually matters. So today I'm going to talk about the state of India in 1945 and the very dim prospects for the continuation of the British Empire in India. By 1945, it was patently clear to most people, most Indians, that the Raj's days were numbered in possibly even into months. It wasn't at all clear in Whitehall that this was the case. The representatives of the British government in Southeast Asia, the likes of Archibald Wavell, the penultimate Viceroy of India, and his successor, Lord Louis Mountbatten, they could both see that the empire was on the critical list, and they urged Britain, and they urged both Churchill and his successor Clement Attlee to tread very carefully in India. It might have occurred to both men that the empire was a busted flush. It was done as a result of the Second World War. There may be some evidence, I think there might be some evidence that they thought it could limp on in some guys, some reformed guys with perhaps Indian Dominion status. Mountbatten's an interesting character because one of his great detractors, Dorman Smith, who had been the previous governor of Burma, who loathed him, saw him as an almost like an aristocratic socialist, a kind of champagne socialist, who had a combination, a curious and slightly contradictory combination of various kind of hierarchical and patriarchal views, combined with a kind of a radical progressive nature and a reformist zeal, and a kind of an egalitarian outlook. And Mountbatten knew that the empire was in serious trouble by 1945, when there was almost no desire on the part of ordinary Indians to see Subhas Chandra Bose's Indian National Army, the men from the Indian National Army who'd been captured or who'd surrendered, to see them prosecuted for treason or prosecuted for any of the war crimes that the INA had committed, along with pretty much everybody else in the Southeast Asia region during the war. And the fact that INA men, when they were repatriated, they were given dishonourable discharges from the British Army. Many of them from the British Indian Army. Many of them had been British Indian Army soldiers first, repatriated back to India. When they got off the trains, they were handed garlands of flowers by complete strangers and cheered and seen as a legitimate army of liberation of India. And when you have those kinds of values and beliefs replicated on all the way across India, there's simply no way for a few 100,000 British administrators and soldiers to even hope about ruling a subcontinent of hundreds of millions. It shows us, interestingly, the extent to which India had to have been ruled by some kind of consensus, some kind of acceptance of British power since the 18th century. And the moment that Indian people choose not to be ruled by the British anymore is really the moment that the empire ends. Now, obviously, across Southeast Asia, particularly in Burma and Malaya, you have all manner of nationalist movements and communist movements and national liberation politicians causing the British all sorts of headaches. But none of these troubles really are anything compared to the obsession that the British have with retaining India, or at least doing something with India. Something, finding some kind of way of governing it within perhaps a commonwealth, or as one of the kind of the dominions of empire. Other nationalist leaders, such as Aung San in Burma, looked to India with a kind of dismay. They believed that the nationalist questions in Burma should be, and Malaya and other such places, should be resolved first, or at least not overshadowed by the nationalist questions in India. And there was a fear amongst smaller Asian nations that an independent India would become a kind of a greater Indian republic, and would perhaps swallow up its neighbours or become the regional hegemon once the British had gone home. And Jawaharlal Nehru was at pains to prevent this from becoming a kind of a popular idea, though amongst certain members of the Congress Party it is an extremely popular idea. Very rarely do you get countries come to kind of national liberation moments. Very rarely do you get them experiencing these moments of liberation from a kind of a controlling empire, and not have key individuals within the political or cultural sphere thinking, well, what next? Where could we go? Well, now we're independent, we could actually kind of rule this whole region, or expand our borders, or what have you. So that was an idea that was certainly circulating at the time. After the general election of 1945, of course, it's not Churchill any longer, who's loathed by Indian nationalists, who's calling the shots. It is a Labour Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. Attlee had served on the Simon Commission of 1927, which was a constitutional inquiry into the future of India. It didn't include any Indians at the time and was greatly resented, and there was a feeling by Indian nationalists that the opportunity that they might have had to decide their own fate had once again been hijacked by white British people. And they also accused the Simon Commission of being a device for dividing and ruling between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. Nehru and Sir Stafford Cripps, who'd come to India during the war, part of the Cripps mission, were both fellow travellers on the left, overt, not simply kind of. Cripps wasn't just simply a Labour politician, but a explicitly socialist in his views, and he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the post-war government. And he came from a kind of a rich Fabian heritage. He was related to Beatrice Webb, but the two had really fallen out as a result. Nehru and Cripps had fallen out as a result of the Cripps mission in 1942, and the Cripps mission had attempted to create a kind of a constitution for India where the Simon Commission had failed, and it too is unsuccessful. So by the end of the war, there is no constitutional future for India, or no constitutional settlement planned out for the post-war world. And yet you have a Labour Party which is at least nominally committed to Indian independence. The progressive wings of the Labour Party had viewed imperialism as a sin for much of the kind of the interwar period. One indication of Attlee's intent was the appointment of Lord Pethick Lawrence as the Secretary of State for India. He had been involved with the kind of the issue of home rule since the 1920s. Pethick Lawrence and his wife, who had been one of the early suffragists, and were had equated really the battle for suffrage and the battle for kind of the rights of working people in Britain to also the struggle for suffrage in India, the struggle for a sovereign government in India. To think of the Labour Party in the 1940s as being overtly socialist is often a kind of a mistake, really. I think what you're looking at is something, a kind of a crusading Christian liberal party, if you will. It had all the elements of kind of Gladstonian morality with the desire for dramatic state intervention that had really been born kind of 1906, of the kind of the people's budget era, and they found an ally in India in the guise of Gandhi. Gandhi combined Hindu ideas and a great many Christian ideas as well, because it's always ignored how many Christians and the influence of Christians, particularly as a result of visitations by Syrian Christians to India throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. But there are a great many Christians in India, and India is actually suffused with Christian ideas. Gandhi was a great fan of Tolstoy and saw, as Tolstoy did, a great deal of potential in the ordinary peasant people of India and peasant organisation, and that there was something kind of essentially moral and decent coming from the peasantry, which would shape the soul of India. Both Tolstoy and Gandhi had this combination of, in Russia and India respectively, of these very spiritual ideas about the direction and the future of society. So the Labour Party found a kind of after Nehru and Cripps had kind of fallen out, they find a more compatible person in the guise of Gandhi. Gandhi was very popular with the grassroots of the Labour Party and had been since his visit to Britain between the wars. But actually, Pethick Lawrence distrusted him. He thought he was a divisive figure. He thought that he was perhaps angling for a civil war with India's Muslims, and that he was intolerant and incapable of compromise. I don't see that there's a great deal of evidence to support what Pethick Lawrence had to say, but the fact that he was saying it anyway is nonetheless interesting, and gives us a much more rounded view of Gandhi. And unfortunately, like Martin Luther King or Winston Churchill, he becomes one of these figures from the 20th century that is so mythologized that it's very difficult to engage critically with him. Particularly the figures that are enormously kind of revered or canonized. It's very difficult to look at them as human beings with inevitable feet of clay. But if there were suspicions of the Congress, and also the British government had suspicions of Muhammad Ali Jinnah's Muslim League, this was reciprocated tenfold. The Congress had learned not to trust the British throughout the last 2 or 3 decades. And they had learned also not just to mistrust the Conservatives, but also Labour as well. The Cripps mission particularly, and its failure in 1942, and the inability to strike a compromise between Britain and the Congress, had really raised all sorts of suspicions about Labour in the eyes of the Indian Congress movement. And the Indian Congress movement was anticipating the possibility of a Labour government after 1945, and was mindful of Sir Stafford Cripps and the example he had set. But the strength from which Congress were now able to speak wasn't born of a kind of just rhetoric alone. It was born of the new realities of the post-war world. The Indian Army had fought extremely well during the Second World War. It had fought in Burma, it had fought in Egypt and the Middle East, and it had fought also in Italy. And Indian servicemen, the Indian army was 1 million strong. It had developed a huge war industry from 1942 onwards in order to support it, and it had fought its way to Rangoon, without any hesitation. It's fair to say that the Indian Army is perhaps one of the great overlooked fighting forces of the Second World War. When you have in northern Italy the Sikhs, Hindus, and Muslims taking on the SS, which indeed did happen, you tend to realise the extent to which they are kind of whitewashed from the pages of history, which is a real shame. And noticeably, this as I was drifting around Waterstones the other day, there are a number of really interesting new titles about India at war, which I shall be talking about in due course. But the British Army had lost Singapore. They'd been forced out of Malaya, they'd lost Burma, and attempts to reclaim all these territories took an immensely long time. The various Arakan campaigns in Burma were of limited success, and the reinvasion of Malaya was only possible, really, because of the detonating of 2 atomic bombs on Japan. Those happened before Britain can land. When a landing does happen in Malaya, it happens largely unopposed, and had it been opposed, it would have been a massacre. There are all sorts of huge logistical problems getting men off boats. The beaches are not suited. The landing grounds are not suitable. So the Japanese essentially allowed the British to recolonise Malaya because the war was essentially over. So looking at these facts, the nationalist movement in India is greatly encouraged by the fact that it has a powerful fighting force behind it, which is almost certainly would declare for Congress if it came to it. And India is a society that has been, as all wars of this nature are, it becomes awash with arms and munitions. And the evidence of that can be seen in the bloodshed that follows during partition. So the facts on the ground very much decide the outcome of independence. The war has revealed huge weaknesses in the British Empire, and it has revealed, it has kind of galvanised and radicalised the military and industrial capabilities of India. The British make a fatal mistake in trying former members of Subhas Chandra Bose's Indian National Army at the Red Fort at Agra, and they are essentially cannot be convicted on grounds of treason and are given what amounts to a slap on the wrist. But they skillfully use, with Congress Party lawyers, and the Congress Party is kind of full of lawyers, they use the opportunity to debate the rights and wrongs of the issue, and they essentially say that they were an army fighting for a sovereign government. The INA, Bose's government had been recognised by various nation states, admittedly ones that didn't like Britain very much, like Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. But it had some degree, some clear degree of moral legitimacy. It had a territory to work from, the Andaman Islands in the Indian Ocean, which have been claimed as sovereign territory by Bose. And they were working towards the liberation of India from an occupying power. And they said, well, is that not really the whole point of the Second World War, to liberate places from illegal occupation by imperial powers that had deposited themselves against a reluctant population. Surely that's what the whole war was about. And there wasn't a jury in India willing to convict them. The whole thing is an epic PR disaster for the British. The British, who could see that the trial had backfired even before it had ended. Now, Nehru was not necessarily jubilant about the role of a newly militarily invigorated Indian Army or the Indian National Army. He thought that India would obviously, after independence, need a strong defence force, but he wondered whether the INA faction would be more trouble than it was worth, whether perhaps it would be too radical, or perhaps you would have a scenario like Parliament faced after the Civil War, with a restless new model army demanding demanding its own share in power, something perhaps like that. So he eyed this all with immense suspicion. But perhaps the most pressing problem for Nehru and for the British in India was Bengal. Bengal during the war had experienced famine. It had been on the front line facing Japanese invasion, and it had also been the home for countless Burmese and Malays who had fled their homelands in advance of the Japanese, and also Indians and British who had been colonisers in Burma and Malaya, who had also fled and had in fact been, particularly the Indian colonisers who had been encouraged to settle in Burma, who had been the subject of a kind of a Burmese nationalist ethnic cleansing with the tacit approval of the Japanese in 1942. So you've got this state on India's eastern border, which is awash with firearms, with displaced people, with an immense amount of anger, which had been the victim of a terrible famine that killed 3 million, for which both the British and the Japanese have kind of equal responsibility in causing. And it is a kind of a powder keg waiting to explode. Punjab had traditionally been a centre of anti-British terrorist activity, and there is violence is kind of equally shared out between nationalist agitators and general kind of banditry and gangsterism during 1945, as the ability of the British to effectively police Bengal goes into steep decline. All of this would have been greatly appreciated by the recently deceased Subhas Chandra Bose. You can check out my previous podcast on him, as he was a Bengali. And in Bengal, he was a widely, immensely respected individual, as was his family. And the moment that normal, in inverted commas, normal political life returns to Bengal, there is immediate unrest, protest, and chaos, rendering it largely ungovernable. And it was, of course, Bengal and Calcutta, which had been the first places that had been colonised by the British, and it was essentially the birthplace of the British Empire in India, was the first place really to declare a kind of a de facto independence from British law and order. So that's really the status of India in 1945. I mean, obviously, India limps on for another 2 years until independence. But I think what you have in 1945 is a situation where an Indian national government is not yet established, but a British government of India and the viceroyship of India has virtually lost the ability to, in certain parts of the country, to rule, and has certainly lost in most parts of the country any kind of legitimacy. And it's that loss of legitimacy that makes the end of empire an inevitability. Which again leads us to an interesting conclusion, and it suggests that to some extent, empire is predicated on a degree of consent. At least it must be predicated on the degree of influential and or ruling classes in India agreeing to be part of the imperial project. Okay, so I'm glad you found that useful. Now there is a much awaited 2015 book review of the year, which I've been working on, and due to a variety of geographical ups and downs during the Christmas period, has yet to make it to you. So it will be coming later this week, if slightly belated, and I'm sure you can pick up some of these brilliant titles in the sales. Anyway, I hope you guys all have a terrific 2016, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. Bye-bye.